when you were a child, your parents read to you.
Yes.
In your books, you mentioned two specific books. One is called When We Were Very Young,
Yes.
and the other one, The Elephant's Child by Kipling.
Yeah.
So from this first encounter with literature, what do you remember the most?
The sound, the cadence of the words. Maybe not so much the content, although the content was definitely important because it was engrossing, it captivated me. And my parents did a lot with music too. So sound was important in our family. We were a very talky family. Yeah. So I was lucky in that way. The Elephant's Child was an errant child of elephant who went down the Nile all set with fever trees, and he took his trunk and just hit them as he went, like a kid would do. And it says, all set about with fever trees. And my son also read Kipling, and so he will recite it back to me, and it's like having generations work. I love it.
So let's fast forward from that time in your childhood with the sounds in a family with music to your first publication in 2004, Falcon.
Yes.
And then in 2009 you published User's Guide.
Yes.
So when the desire of becoming a poet became real?
When I was 16.
Okay.
When I wrote the world's worst poem.
Do you remember the title of the poem?
No, but I remember what it was about. And it was a poem that came from my unconscious, which is the way I write.
Okay.
But I didn't know that at the time. And so I wrote this poem about a little girl who was in the woods and came to a stream, fell into the stream, and maybe drowned herself, perished, and certainly. And I think it was really about becoming an adolescent and losing my childhood. But I had no idea that that's what it was about. But my teacher, who was a really great professor at the New School of Social Research in New York, who also taught at my school, called me in and wanted to talk about the poem. And he understood the poem. I didn't. But what I got from the poem was a sense of writing from the inside. And it stayed with me forever. And so when I came back to when I had to do some teaching and to support myself and so on, when I was able to devote myself more in terms of time and energy to poetry, at that point, it was still with me, and I was ready to go.
So in that first poem, you kind of had a certain way of writing that has stayed with you until today?
I think it's more, not so much the style of the
Not the style, but the source of it?
Yes, and the experience of being, there are all kinds of words for it, in the zone, you hear lots of things. Yeah. I think that experience was what I do today, and I started doing it about 30 years ago in a professional way, actually learning to be a professional.
Was it easy to publish your first book, Falcon?
It just happened. It was not easy or hard. It was just what I did. But I suddenly thought I had a collection, and just having that concept of having a collection and putting it together felt good.
In 2010, you published the St. Louis Suite, and then Summer Hunger, also the same year.
Yeah.
Many of the poems in Summer Hunger are memories of your childhood, your teenage years, and one of the lines says, "I assemble in my eyes the lives I know."
Yes.
That's from St. Louis Suite. So when you navigate the confessional side of your poetry, and also when you write about the lives of others, how do you manage how much to share?
Well, certainly when I write it out the first time, I don't let anything, I don't hold back. I put everything out there.
Okay.
Editing is hugely important. When I edit, I take away sentimentality as much as possible. I pull back. I kind of learned that from Elizabeth Bishop, just from reading. But I don't want to be a sentimental poet.
Would you mind reading from Summer Hunger the poem Piecing?
I think this started, if I'm not mistaken, as a terzerima. I fiddled with it a lot, so it didn't end up in rhyme. But I think it was a terzerima when it began. That's typical of mine. I've already, in fact, made some changes in this, which is what I always do, but not many. Piecing. Days went by before Mother asked, "Where is that silk?" And I, nesting on her yellow quilt, traced the pieces, counted stitches. Father brought 2 satin scarves from France. One splashed paisleys, purple, gold. For Mother, yes, the perfect match for her evening gown, her beaded bag. For me, the schoolgirl blue. But hers matched my iridescent taffeta, would cling to me as skin, floating at the senior prom with Roger Rose as the mirrored globe turns slow, scattering green and rose confetti light around. Her open drawer, the scented scarf, gone without a word, simply slipstreamed in the dark, fluttering wing-like as silk will do, sliding into moonleaf shadow. I tried to say I borrowed it, but fingering the quilt threads, wondered if what bound me safe would snap, if truth was worth the telling.
In 2019, you published the book Cumulus Fiction,
Mm-hmm.
and all the poems in the book, they are responses to haiku.
Right.
Could you describe the format?
Yes, it started as a game, kind of. Richard Garcia thought this up. And as an exercise, one could call it an exercise.
Mm-hmm.
And one takes the words from the haiku, which are read horizontally as one reads in English, and use the words, each word as the first word of a subsequent poem. And then I put in the Japanese, because I wanted, it's got Japanese in the book as well, as you know, which is vertical, which is the way haiku was written originally.
Basically, you take the words of the haiku, and then each word of the haiku is the first word, in every line.
In every line. And so you can reread the haiku, the translation of the haiku, vertically, if you choose. And if you're lucky enough to read and understand Japanese. That it's an accurate, not retranslation, but the original. It's accurate of the original to read in between the two.
What did you learn from this? Because it's a big constriction to do that, because you are forced to start the lines with a given word. What did you learn from that constriction?
Well, no, it's very interesting. It's the same learning that you have when you write in form.
In form.
So it's no different, and I've never had a problem. In fact, it's easier for me to write in form than to write free verse. It is just easier, or even if it's metered verse, not free, it's easier for me. So it was a gift. So I could just let go. I mean, it's a wonderful, not for everybody. I'm sure everybody's different.
So is it easier for you because it gives you like a scaffolding of the poem? Or?
It's a jumping off place.
Okay.
And it frees me to go in any direction. It's actually more freeing than sculpting a poem, shaping a poem without any prompts.
Yeah.
But I do both. Now I've done, without form for so long, I'm moving back to form a little. Not a lot, but a little.
Could you read one
Sure.
example of the poems from Cumulus Fiction?
So this is number 2, and out of 20. There are 20 poems in the book. And I like to think that other people have the same struggles I do. So that's why this poem, I'm interested that you chose it, because most of the poems in here are self-revealing. This one certainly is. And The haiku is by Isa. Mosquito at my ear, does it think I'm deaf? And then comes the haiku, written as original in Japanese, and then my poem. Mosquito wings whine at or near E flat. Remind me of myself, of what I want to hear. The closed ear doesn't, and the head does. It listens to what does stroking, ignores the rest. It is joy and despair, hope and shame. Sometimes I think the self needs an introduction, a way in. I'm struggling with that habit, choosing to be deaf.
Also in 2019, you published a full collection entitled Infirmary for a Private Soul. In one of the poems of this collection, you say, a name, the right name, seems essential to the poem's form and diction. And it's interesting that you mention form and diction, but you don't mention meaning. And this is also connected to what you share in the beginning of the conversation about your experience as a child when you remember the sound of the
Yeah.
stories. So, do you write for the pleasure of sound?
I always consider that when I write. And I think probably I write for the pleasure of senses, of almost all the senses. And I think certainly sound started me. And I guess in, the 8th century when people wrote pantoums, for example, they were ballads. They weren't ballads then in that form, but they were songs. Poetry was a song. So yeah, I think it has always a component. And when I rewrite and re-edit.
You edit the editing process?
I do. And that's always a consideration.
I think one example of this writing for the pleasure of sound is the poem in, it's called Prayer, in this book, Infirmary for the Private Soul.
There's a chant in here that's a Cree Native American, the Cree Indian chant, Native American Indian chant, just so that if it sounds like there's a chant in the middle, it's because there is. Yeah. And this is a very personal poem, and it does sound plays a part in this. And I don't know, I refer to the Brahms Alto Rhapsody. Do you know that? And
no.
So that's what the quote is from in here.
Okay.
And it's a gorgeous piece of music. Everybody should have that in their lives. So that's very important to me. I can hear it, always I can hear it. Prayer. Call it birth from what was, land and water, muck, pail and shovel, box and sand, toes, fingers squeeze wet earth, mud pies to fruit pies, batter to biscuits, scribble to strophe, one's own subjective subjunctive, one's perfect future perfect, a past and present cry for milk, the chant, water, water, where's your daughter? The taste of ripened grass in fresh butter. Bronze sung full-throated, ist auf deinen Psalter. May I never lose those early breaths, eager, hunger for something unknown, that thirst for song.
When I read your poems, there is like an international or foreign presence. You have mentioned Salvador Espriu, the Catalan poet. There is also a Polish poet, Tadeusz Różewicz.
Yes.
I don't know how to pronounce it properly. But,
nor do I.
And also a Brazilian poet, Carlos Drummond de Andrade. Oh. And of course you have a full book devoted to haiku. What's behind these international connections or references?
Well, as a poet, certainly you recognize and I recognize that what we write doesn't have boundaries. And, you know, I feel very deeply that I don't know enough about so many places. There's a whole empty spot for really a deep knowledge of Asian poetry. I don't think I know it, or even Indian. But the areas the places that I've been, where I've experienced life, I find it's just natural to write about it. And I don't ever think in terms of borders. I think in terms of a kind of a commonality of ideas and of feelings, and that everybody shares them. So if it's a successful poem, which I'm not saying that mine are always, but one hopes, one strives for, you know, reaching people in the same way that they would be reached by life.
There's an abundance of these references to kind of poets from other languages and some others. So
I like to read as widely as I can. I don't always, but I had a lot of wonderful training with David St. John. Mm-hmm. We read widely, and that was very influential to me. Another
presence in your poetry language, I think, is surrealism. Yeah. There is a touch of the surrealist in your poems. For example, in a poem called Rubber Gloves. Yeah. So could you talk about your connection with surrealism, and then if you don't mind reading the poem?
Well, I think South American surrealist poetry had a big influence on me, and Carlos Drummond was one. But of course, he wasn't as surrealist as some others. But surrealism it's really founded in the unconscious, mm-hmm. which is why I'm sort of drawn to it. And it was just plain fun to write that poem. It really was. Shall I read it?
Yes.
Would you like me to read
it?
I think I have it. Here it is, Rubber Gloves. Cobalt blue flopping. You sensibly bring them to me to wear. I never do. Later, the washed pans and pots set out to dry for the night. The gloves rest on the sink's edge, composed as hands folded on a lap. In the morning, 2 yellow gloves lie between the blue, as though they were always there. We leave them again that night. By morning, 1 more appears. Now there are 5. After sweet greens, lentil soup, supper dishes, the gloves lay damp, peaceful, relaxed in their usual posture, one over the other. This morning, only 3 lie on the drain board, 1 yellow, a blue, and orange, each distinct, comfortable, separate from the other, as uncomprehending as my insensible hands, rough and raw as the eucalyptus bark peeling just outside my window.
Gail Vronsky, the poet Gail
Yes.
Vronsky, from LA poet, wrote a blurb for your book, Infirmary for the Private Soul. And in that blurb, she says more or less that your poem On the Dresser, which is the poem that opens the collection, that poem works as an ars poetica. And I think it's true that the elements that build that poem are also the elements that build many of your poems. For example, desire, a certain reserve, meditation, introspection, a dialogue with the everyday life, and also a sense of discovery or surprise. Do you agree with Gail that that poem could be your ars poetica?
Well, it could be, and I think actually, I think she's right, it was. But it could also be just a sensual poem, a poem about an erotic poem, if you wanted it to be that. But I think it is an ars poetica. But it's so interesting because I think she identified it in a way that I hadn't. but I reread it and thought, she's absolutely right. And Elizabeth Bishop's The Fish is another one that I read, never thinking of it as an Ars Poetica, but it is. And I wonder if when she wrote it in Newfoundland, which is where she was, if she recognized it as that or what. Sometimes it's just, she's not around to ask.
So the poem is, the poem is called On a Dresser.
Green stem erect in a glass, tulip sepals taut, over petals, the bud, a promise. Call it shy for now, or arch. There's a certain reserve, but the bloom's warm skin implies something more has elapsed. Days, peach-colored heat, wet air, and the petals half open as lids after deep sleep. The stalk tips, anthers slim and dark, bend and blink. Call it modesty, a slow revelation. One morning, or is it afternoon, slanted sun hits the dresser, and it doesn't matter anymore. The stem doubles over, petals widen. A footstep sets the wanton orange flesh trembling. A shadow memory of petals falling, of letting go.
It's interesting, when I read the book, I had, you know, your mind goes to many places.
Sure.
Of course, I went to the Surrealist movement, I went to a lot of music, and references, but I also went to Zurbarán, the Spanish painter, contemporary of Velázquez, because he does these still lifes.
They're gorgeous.
Yeah, so for example, like the gloves, the tulip, and many times it's like this has that, because many of the Zurbarán's still lifes, they have meditative quality. So
they're amazing.
Yeah, so that's, some of the poems are like, oh, this is like and they trigger the subconscious in a way.
I think this poem, I remember exactly how and when I wrote it. It was not from a painting, but from the most beautiful tulips that were almost at the end, and they had bent over. And I just thought, this is the most erotic flower I've ever experienced. So I wrote about it.
I believe that you also belong to a workshop that has been active for 20 years, or almost 20 years.
More than 20
More
years
than 20
now.
years. Yes, talk a little bit about the importance of the poetry community in your life and also in your poetry production.
Well, it's an anchor. It's this very stable, sort of unchanging anchor in all of our lives. And it's been nourishing. We do critical work. Sometimes we will study a poet and do that, but usually it's our own work that we're studying. And we spend a lot of time on each poem that each person brings. It's a group of about, well, when we're assembled, it usually comes to around 10. I think there are 13 of us now, but I may be wrong about that, but it's gotten larger because some people can't come all the time. It's a wonderful, wonderful group. We are bonded by now after all these years, and we learn from each other, and each has a distinct voice. And each voice is honored. Dorothy is a terrific workshop leader. David was also just inspirational, and he would bring in, the culture, the country, the history, the time, the customs, bring in the film. It was just an amazing experience to work with him, as it is with Dorothy.
What are you working on right now? You mentioned that you are working on something related to the subconscious mind.
Actually, I thought about it in terms of initially about how you formulate your conscience. Part of that is because we're living in a political time now where the tender is not the truth. And I have a kind of a need for a kind of accuracy and honesty a truth. And lying is a big problem for me. Big. And because of the political scene now, it sort of matters more to me that I be the honest person and showing myself with restraint, thanks to Elizabeth Bishop, and who I really learned from tremendously. I learned from her. But I think it's kind of a critical part of every human being. It's how you start. And so I'm doing a collection that comes from the conscience. And I've written some poems in form and some not in form. And I have probably about 5 or 6. And I want to increase it. I don't want a huge book, maybe even a chapbook. But I think it's a really important one, at least for me.
So do you mind reading an example?
No, I'm happy to read. Someone knows her name, and it's Los Angeles, August 2019. Who's the woman? What's her name? Changing in the restroom, splashing armpits with cold water. Room to roam in privacy, room to rest, collect oneself. I brush away croissant crumbs, move along. She's come and gone, daily routines other now, but not her car. Someone knows her name. There are days she's properly arranged, shame hidden. Idaho, Tennessee, the streets she parks on intersect in noise, confusion. Invisible, she can be seen. Once she had breakfast, lunch, and dinner at a table set for 2, clean sheets and towels, a bed. The silence of alone, the noise within. Someone knows her face, her fear, my shame for moving on.
Thank you very much.